The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, yet somehow they found themselves standing at its center. "Hold me still," Nancy Collins whispered, her voice barely audible in the dim light of the living room, and Janet Garcia felt her world tilt on its axis as Nancy's lips found the sensitive skin of her neck. Warm and soft and everything Janet had dreamed of for 2 years and 4 months, but never dared to hope for. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two best friends crossed the invisible line that had separated them for so long, one would have to go back to the beginning, to a Tuesday evening 3 months earlier when everything changed with a single, seemingly innocent request. Janet had been curled up on her couch, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands as she scrolled through her phone, when Nancy burst through the front door without knocking. This wasn't unusual. Nancy had a key, and she used it frequently, treating Janet's apartment like a second home. What was unusual was the way Nancy's shoulders were shaking, the way her normally perfect hair was disheveled, and the way her eyes were red-rimmed and glassy. "He broke up with me," Nancy announced without preamble, dropping her purse by the door and kicking off her heels with more force than necessary. Janet set her coffee aside immediately, her heart doing that familiar twist it always did when Nancy was hurt. Matthew Jones had been Nancy's boyfriend for 8 months, and while Janet had never particularly liked him, she knew Nancy had been hopeful about their relationship. The fact that he had ended things clearly devastated her. "Oh, honey," Janet said, rising from the couch and opening her arms. Nancy fell into them gratefully, and Janet held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume mixed with something sharper, something that spoke of tears and heartbreak. They stood like that for a long moment, Nancy's face buried in Janet's shoulder, Janet's hands stroking her hair. Janet tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened at Nancy's proximity, tried to focus on being the supportive friend Nancy needed rather than acknowledging the electricity that always seemed to spark between them whenever they touched. "What happened?" Janet asked softly when Nancy finally pulled back, though she kept her hands on Nancy's shoulders, reluctant to break all contact. Nancy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her mascara slightly. "He said I was distant. That I never seemed fully present when we were together." She laughed bitterly. "Maybe he was right. I don't know. I couldn't connect with him the way I wanted to. The way I thought I should." Janet felt that familiar knife twist in her chest, the one that came whenever Nancy talked about her relationships, about how something was always missing, always just out of reach. Janet knew what was missing. She had known for 2 years and 4 months, ever since the night Nancy had fallen asleep on this very couch after a particularly brutal day at work, and Janet had watched her sleep, studying the curve of her cheekbones in the flickering light of the television, and realized with startling clarity that she was completely, hopelessly in love with her best friend. "I'm sorry," Janet said instead of voicing any of these thoughts. "Do you want to talk about it?" Nancy shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. "Actually, can I ask you something? Something that might sound weird." Janet's heart skipped. "Of course. Anything. Do you ever feel like you're playing a role? Like, in relationships?" Nancy's blue eyes searched Janet's face intently. "Like you're doing what you're supposed to do, saying what you're supposed to say, but it doesn't feel real?" The question hit Janet like a physical blow. She had felt exactly like that in every relationship she'd ever had with a man. She had gone through the motions, said the right words, even convinced herself she was happy, but there had always been something hollow about it, something performative. It wasn't until she met Nancy that she understood what real connection felt like, even if it was one-sided. "Yes," Janet said quietly. "I know exactly what you mean." Something shifted in Nancy's expression, a flicker of recognition, of understanding. "Really? Really?" Janet's voice was barely above a whisper. They looked at each other for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, and Janet felt the air between them charge with something electric, something dangerous. Then Nancy's phone buzzed with a text message, breaking the spell, and the moment passed. "I should probably go," Nancy said, though she made no move to leave. "It's late, and you probably have work tomorrow." "You don't have to go," Janet said quickly. Too quickly. "I mean, if you don't want to be alone tonight. You could stay here. On the couch, or..." She trailed off, heat rising in her cheeks. Nancy's eyes softened. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. You're never an imposition, Janet said, and meant it completely. So Nancy stayed, borrowing one of Janet's oversized t-shirts and a pair of sleep shorts. They settled on the couch together to watch something mindless on Netflix, Nancy curled against Janet's side in a way that felt both perfectly natural and completely devastating. Janet tried to focus on the screen, but her attention kept drifting to the weight of Nancy's head on her shoulder, the way Nancy's hair tickled her neck, the warmth radiating from Nancy's body where it pressed against hers. Janet. Nancy's voice was soft, drowsy. Thank you. For always being here. For always knowing exactly what I need. Janet's throat tightened. Always, she managed. Nancy tilted her head to look up at her, and, for a moment, Janet thought she saw something in Nancy's eyes, something that looked almost like longing. But then Nancy smiled that familiar, friendly smile and settled back against her shoulder, and Janet told herself she had imagined it. That night marked the beginning of something new between them, though neither acknowledged it directly. Nancy started spending more time at Janet's apartment, often arriving unannounced with takeout or a bottle of wine, claiming she needed a break from her empty apartment. Their conversations grew deeper, more intimate, touching on subjects they had never explored before. Do you think there's such a thing as soulmates? Nancy asked one evening about 2 weeks later. They were sitting on Janet's balcony, sharing a bottle of wine as the sun set over the city. Janet nearly choked on her wine. What brought that on? I don't know. I've been thinking a lot lately about connection, about what it means to really know someone. Nancy swirled the wine in her glass, watching the liquid catch the golden light. Like, with Matthew, I felt like I was always performing, always trying to be the person he wanted me to be. But with you, I can just be. You know? I never have to pretend with you. Janet's heart hammered against her ribs. I feel the same way, she said carefully. Do you? Nancy turned to look at her directly, and Janet was struck by the intensity in her gaze. Sometimes I think you know me better than I know myself. Nancy. Janet started, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. How could she tell Nancy that she had spent 2 years memorizing every expression that crossed her face, cataloging every laugh, every sigh, every unconscious gesture? How could she explain that loving Nancy had become as natural and necessary as breathing? I've been having these dreams, Nancy continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Strange dreams. About? She trailed off, shaking her head. Never mind. It's stupid. It's not stupid, Janet said firmly. What kind of dreams? Nancy was quiet for so long that Janet thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Dreams about kissing someone. But not Matthew. Not any of the guys I've dated. Someone else. Someone with soft hands and kind eyes and... She looked directly at Janet. Someone who makes me feel safe. The air between them crackled with tension. Janet felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong word would send her tumbling into the abyss. What do you think the dreams mean? She asked, proud of how steady her voice sounded. I don't know, Nancy admitted. That's what scares me. They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, electric, full of words neither of them was brave enough to speak. When Nancy left that night, she hugged Janet goodbye at the door, and the embrace lasted longer than usual, Nancy's arms tightening around Janet's waist as if she didn't want to let go. Sweet dreams, Nancy whispered against Janet's ear, and Janet shivered at the warmth of her breath. The dream's comment haunted Janet for days. She found herself analyzing every interaction with Nancy, looking for signs, for clues about what Nancy might be feeling. The touches seemed to linger longer. The eye contact felt more intense. Nancy started finding excuses to be physically close, brushing against Janet when she reached for something, letting their hands touch when passing objects back and forth, curling up against Janet's side during their movie nights. 3 weeks after the balcony conversation, Nancy showed up at Janet's apartment on a Friday night with Chinese takeout and a troubled expression. Bad day? Janet asked, taking the bags from Nancy's hands. Confusing day, Nancy corrected, following Janet to the kitchen. My coworker Lauren asked me something today that I can't stop thinking about. Janet began unpacking the containers, trying to appear casual despite the way her pulse had quickened. What did she ask? She asked if I'd ever been attracted to a woman. Janet's hands stilled. Oh, what did you tell her? I said no, of course. But then she asked if I'd ever thought about it, and Nancy ran her hands through her hair, a gesture Janet recognized as a sign of frustration or confusion. I couldn't answer her, Janet. I just stood there like an idiot, and she got this knowing look and said maybe I should think about it. Janet forced herself to continue unpacking the food, though her hands were trembling slightly. And have you? Thought about it, I mean. That's just it, Nancy said, leaning against the counter. I realized I have been thinking about it. More than I should, probably. More than someone who's completely straight should. The container of lo mein slipped from Janet's fingers, clattering onto the counter. Nancy. I keep having these thoughts, Nancy continued, her voice gaining momentum as if she had been holding these words back for weeks. About what it would be like to kiss a woman. To be with someone who understands what it's like to be a woman, who would touch me the way I want to be touched, who would know instinctively what I need. Janet gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. And how do you want to be touched? The question slipped out before she could stop it, her voice barely above a whisper. Nancy's eyes widened, and for a moment, Janet thought she had gone too far, crossed a line they couldn't uncross. But then Nancy stepped closer, close enough that Janet could see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes. Gently, Nancy said softly. Like I'm something precious. Like every touch matters. Janet's breath caught. Nancy. I think about gentle fingers tracing patterns on my skin, Nancy continued, her voice dreamy, hypnotic. About soft lips and patient hands and someone who would take their time with me, who would make me feel like I'm the only thing that matters in the world. Janet felt like she was drowning, like the kitchen was spinning around her. Nancy was describing exactly how Janet wanted to touch her, exactly how Janet had imagined it in her most secret moments. That sounds beautiful, Janet managed. It does, doesn't it? Nancy smiled, but there was something vulnerable in her expression. The thing is, when I imagine it, when I try to picture this woman who would touch me like that, she has your eyes. The words hit Janet like a physical blow. She stared at Nancy, searching her face for any sign that she was joking, that this was some kind of cruel test. But Nancy's expression was serious, almost scared, and Janet realized with stunning clarity that Nancy was confessing something, taking a leap of faith. My eyes. Janet's voice cracked. Your eyes, Nancy confirmed. Your hands. Your smile. It's always you, Janet. In every fantasy, every dream, every moment when I imagine what real love might feel like, it's you. Janet felt tears prick her eyes. Nancy, I know this is crazy, Nancy rushed on. I know we're friends, and I know I've only ever dated men, and I know this could ruin everything between us. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep pretending that what I feel for you is just friendship when it's so much more than that. Janet launched herself across the small space between them, cupping Nancy's face in her hands. It's not crazy, she said fiercely. It's not crazy at all. It's not. Nancy's voice was small, hopeful. I've been in love with you for 2 years and 4 months, Janet confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. Since the night you fell asleep on my couch and I watched you sleep and realized that everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, was wrong. It was all wrong because I was looking in the wrong direction. I was looking for something that could never exist because what I needed was right here, right in front of me. Nancy's eyes filled with tears. 2 years and 4 months? 2 years and 4 months of pretending to be just your friend when all I wanted was to tell you how beautiful you are, how much I love your laugh, how you make everything better just by existing. 2 years and 4 months of listening to you talk about boyfriends who didn't deserve you and biting my tongue because I knew I could love you better than any of them ever could. Oh, Janet, Nancy breathed, and then she was kissing her, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as Janet kissed her back with 2 years' worth of suppressed longing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Nancy rested her forehead against Janet's. I feel like such an idiot, she whispered. All this time, I was looking for something that was right here. You're not an idiot, Janet said, stroking Nancy's cheek with her thumb. You were figuring yourself out. That takes time. I wasted so much time. We have all the time in the world now. They kissed again, slower this time, deeper, and Janet marveled at how perfectly Nancy fit in her arms, how right this felt after years of wondering and hoping and dreaming. I'm scared, Nancy admitted when they came up for air. Me too, Janet said honestly. But we'll figure it out together. Together, Nancy repeated, like she was testing the word. I like the sound of that. They spent the rest of the evening on the couch, Nancy curled in Janet's arms as they talked about everything and nothing, about the future and the past, and all the moments between them that suddenly made sense in this new context. Nancy traced patterns on Janet's arm with her fingertip, and every touch sent electricity shooting through Janet's system. Can I tell you something? Nancy asked as the evening grew late. Anything. That night 3 months ago, when Matthew broke up with me, I wasn't really upset about losing him. I was upset because I realized I had been using him, using all of them, to avoid dealing with what I really felt. What I really wanted. Janet's arms tightened around her. What did you really want? You, Nancy said simply. I wanted you to hold me and tell me everything would be okay and never let me go. I wanted to fall asleep in your arms and wake up to your face and not have to pretend it was just friendship. You can have that now, Janet whispered. You can have all of that. Can I stay tonight? Nancy asked. Not on the couch. With you. Janet's heart raced. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. So they went to Janet's bedroom, and Nancy borrowed another of Janet's t-shirts, and they lay together in the dark, talking in whispers until exhaustion finally claimed them. Janet fell asleep with Nancy's head on her chest, Nancy's arm draped across her waist, and woke to find Nancy watching her with soft, wondering eyes. Good morning, Nancy whispered. Good morning, Janet replied, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from Nancy's face. How did you sleep? Better than I have in months, Nancy admitted. Maybe years. They lay there for a while, trading soft kisses and gentle touches, marveling at this new intimacy between them. Eventually, hunger drove them to the kitchen, where they made coffee and toast and fed each other bites of jam-covered bread, laughing at the sweetness of it all. What happens now? Nancy asked as they sat at Janet's small kitchen table, their hands intertwined on the surface between them. What do you want to happen? Nancy was quiet for a moment, considering. I want to try this. Really try. I want to see where this goes, what we could be together. Even though it's new for you? Even though you're not sure about everything. I'm sure about you, Nancy said firmly. I'm sure about how you make me feel. The rest, we can figure out as we go. Janet brought Nancy's hand to her lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. Then we'll figure it out together. The next few weeks passed in a blur of discovery and wonder. They took things slowly, both aware that this was uncharted territory for Nancy, both wanting to savor every moment of this new phase of their relationship. They went on their first official date to a small Italian restaurant across town, holding hands across the table and sharing bites of pasta like teenagers in love. Nancy was nervous at first, glancing around to see if anyone was watching them, but Janet's steady presence and gentle encouragement helped her relax into the moment. I keep waiting for it to feel weird, Nancy confessed as they walked home, their fingers interlaced. But it doesn't. It feels like the most natural thing in the world. Because it is natural, Janet said. For us, it is. They had their first fight 3 weeks into their official relationship, a stupid argument about whose turn it was to do the dishes that escalated into something bigger, something about fear and change and the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone completely. Nancy stormed out, and Janet spent the night crying into her pillow, convinced she had lost the best thing that had ever happened to her. Nancy came back the next morning with coffee and apology donuts, her eyes red from her own sleepless night. I'm sorry, she said before Janet could even open the door fully. I'm sorry for running away. I'm sorry for being scared. I'm sorry for taking it out on you. I'm sorry too, Janet said, pulling Nancy inside. I shouldn't have pushed. You weren't pushing. You were being patient, and I was being an idiot. Nancy set the coffee and donuts on the counter and turned to face Janet fully. I love you, Janet. I love you in a way I've never loved anyone, and that scares the hell out of me. But losing you would scare me more. You're not going to lose me, Janet promised, wrapping Nancy in her arms. We're going to fight sometimes. All couples do. But we're going to work through it because what we have is worth fighting for. Worth fighting for, Nancy repeated, and kissed her with a passion that took Janet's breath away. They made up thoroughly, talking through their fears and insecurities, establishing boundaries and safe words and ways to communicate when things got overwhelming. Janet learned that Nancy needed reassurance sometimes, needed to be reminded that this was real, that Janet wasn't going anywhere. Nancy learned that Janet needed honesty, needed to know when Nancy was struggling so she could help rather than guess. Their physical relationship deepened gradually, naturally, each touch and caress a revelation. Nancy was endlessly curious, endlessly eager to learn what Janet liked, what made her gasp and arch and whisper Nancy's name like a prayer. Janet was patient and gentle, letting Nancy set the pace, celebrating every small breakthrough and moment of confidence. I never knew it could feel like this, Nancy whispered one evening as they lay tangled together in Janet's bed, both breathless and glowing. I never knew I could feel like this. How do you feel? Janet asked, tracing lazy patterns on Nancy's bare shoulder. Complete, Nancy said without hesitation. Like I've been walking around with a piece of myself missing, and now I've found it. You found it. I've found you, Nancy corrected, tilting her head to look at Janet. I've found us. 2 months into their relationship, Nancy suggested they tell their families. Janet was nervous but ready. Nancy was terrified but determined. They might not understand at first, Nancy warned as they sat in Janet's car outside Nancy's parents' house. My mom always assumed I'd end up with some nice businessman who would give her grandchildren. And now? Now she's going to have to adjust her expectations, Nancy said with a smile that was equal parts nervous and defiant. Because I'm not giving you up for anyone's expectations, including my own. Nancy's parents were surprised, but ultimately accepting, her mother crying and asking if Nancy was happy, her father gruff, but kind as he shook Janet's hand and told her to take care of his daughter. Janet's parents were thrilled, having suspected something was different about their daughter's relationship with Nancy for months. We could tell you were in love, Janet's mother said as she hugged Nancy tightly. We just weren't sure if you both knew it yet. It took us a while to figure it out, Nancy admitted, laughing through her tears. The best things always do, Janet's father said with a wink. As autumn turned to winter, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Nancy spent most nights at Janet's apartment, though she kept her own place for the sake of appearances, and because neither was quite ready for the step of officially moving in together. They cooked dinner together most evenings, Nancy learning to appreciate Janet's vegetarian meals while Janet discovered a love for Nancy's grandmother's meatloaf recipe. They watched terrible reality TV shows and argued about books and planned weekend trips to small towns where they could hold hands without worrying about running into anyone they knew. I have a confession, Nancy said one evening as they walked through the park near Janet's apartment, their breath visible in the cold air. Oh no, Janet teased. What terrible secret are you harboring now? I've been thinking about the future, Nancy said, suddenly serious. Our future. And I know it's probably too early to talk about this, but I keep imagining us in 5 years, 10 years. I imagine us buying a house together, getting a dog, maybe even. She trailed off, blushing. Maybe even what? Maybe even getting married someday, Nancy finished in a rush. If that's something you'd want. If we get to that point. Janet stopped walking, turning to face Nancy fully. Nancy Collins, are you proposing to me? No. Nancy said quickly, then paused. I mean, not yet. Not now. But someday maybe, if you'd want that. Janet silenced her with a kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise. I'd want that, she whispered against Nancy's lips. I'd want all of that with you. They were interrupted by a group of teenagers walking past, one of whom made a disgusted noise and muttered something under his breath about dykes. Nancy tensed, but Janet squeezed her hand reassuringly. Ignore them, Janet said quietly. It doesn't bother you? Nancy asked as they continued walking. It bothers me that they're ignorant, Janet said honestly. But it doesn't bother me that they know I'm in love with you. I'm proud to be in love with you. Nancy stopped walking again, pulling Janet into another kiss, this one deeper, more passionate, right there in the middle of the public park. I love you, she said when they broke apart. I love you so much it sometimes feels like my chest might explode from the sheer force of it. I love you too, Janet replied. More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. As winter deepened, they faced their first real test as a couple when Nancy's ex-boyfriend Matthew reached out, wanting to reconcile. He had heard through mutual friends that Nancy was single again and assumed her relationship with Janet was just a phase, a rebound that would run its course. He wants to take me to dinner, Nancy told Janet, holding up her phone with Matthew's text message. To talk about us getting back together. Janet felt a familiar twist of jealousy and fear, but she forced herself to remain calm. What do you want to do? I want to tell him the truth, Nancy said firmly. I want to tell him that I'm in love with my best friend and I've never been happier in my life. Are you sure? You don't owe him an explanation. I know I don't owe him anything, Nancy said, sitting beside Janet on the couch. But I owe it to myself to be honest about who I am and what I want. And I owe it to you to make sure there's no doubt in anyone's mind about where I stand. So Nancy met Matthew for coffee, not dinner, and told him gently but clearly that she was in a relationship with someone else, someone who made her happier than she had ever been. Matthew didn't take it well, apparently making several cruel comments about Nancy's sexuality and Janet's influence, but Nancy stood firm. He said some awful things, Nancy told Janet that evening, curled up in Janet's arms on the couch. Things I won't repeat because they're not worth giving voice to. But the whole time he was talking, all I could think about was coming home to you, and how nothing he could say would change the way I feel. I'm proud of you, Janet said, kissing the top of Nancy's head. I know that wasn't easy. It was easier than I thought it would be, Nancy admitted. Because I know who I am now. I know what I want. And what I want is you, is the life we're building together. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Nancy got a promotion at work, which meant longer hours, but also meant she could finally afford to contribute equally to their shared expenses. Janet started taking photography classes, something she had always wanted to do, and Nancy became her favorite and most patient subject. Stop moving, Janet laughed as she tried to capture a candid shot of Nancy reading in the morning light. I'm not moving, Nancy protested, then immediately shifted to tuck her legs under her differently. You're impossible, Janet said, but she was smiling as she lowered the camera. Come here. Nancy set her book aside and crawled across the bed to where Janet was sitting. Did you get your shot? I got something better, Janet said, pulling Nancy into her arms. I got you. They made love as the morning sun streamed through the windows, slow and lazy and perfect, and afterward, Nancy traced the tattoo on Janet's shoulder blade that she had discovered months earlier. Tell me about this again, Nancy said, her finger following the delicate lines of the small bird in flight. I got it when I graduated college, Janet said. It was supposed to represent freedom, new beginnings. It's beautiful, Nancy murmured. I've been thinking about getting one. Really? What would you get? Nancy was quiet for a moment, considering. Maybe something to commemorate this year. This transformation. Something to remind me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. What would that look like? I don't know yet, Nancy admitted. But I'll know it when I see it. 2 weeks later, Nancy came home with a small bandage on her wrist and a mischievous smile. You didn't, Janet said, staring at the bandage. I did, Nancy confirmed, carefully peeling back the tape to reveal a tiny compass rose, the north point emphasized in darker ink. So I never forget which direction leads me home. Janet's eyes filled with tears. Nancy. You're my true north, Nancy said simply. You always have been. I just had to learn how to read the compass. Janet kissed her then, soft and reverent, marveling at this woman who continued to surprise and delight her at every turn. Summer arrived with a heat wave that drove them to spend most evenings on Janet's small balcony, sharing cold drinks and planning their first vacation together. They had decided on a week in Maine, renting a small cabin by the ocean where they could be completely themselves without any worry about judgment or explanation. I can't wait to wake up next to you with the sound of waves outside the window, Nancy said as they looked through photos of potential rental properties on Janet's laptop. I can't wait to see you in a bikini, Janet said with a grin, earning herself a playful sweat. Is that all you think about? Nancy teased. No, Janet said, growing serious. I think about how happy you make me. I think about how lucky I am to have found you, to have you choose me back. I think about growing old with you and still feeling this way when we're 80. Nancy's expression softened. When we're 80. When we're 80, Janet confirmed. Still holding hands, still making each other laugh, still falling asleep tangled up together. I love that image, Nancy said quietly. I love the idea of a whole lifetime with you. Their vacation was everything they had hoped for and more. They spent their days walking on the beach, collecting shells and sea glass, reading books in the sun while their skin grew golden and freckled. In the evenings, they cooked simple meals and made love with the windows open, the salt air and the sound of the ocean creating a perfect backdrop for their intimacy. I could stay here forever, Nancy said on their last night as they sat on the small deck of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. We could come back, Janet suggested. Make it an annual tradition. Our place, Nancy said, testing the words. I like that. Our place, Janet agreed, pulling Nancy closer on the small bench they shared. When they returned home, they found their relationship had shifted again, deepened by the week of uninterrupted time together. They moved through their daily routines with an ease that felt almost married, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with glances and touches as much as words. I think I'm ready, Nancy said one evening in late August as they cleaned up after dinner. Ready for what? Janet asked, though something in Nancy's tone made her pulse quicken. Ready to move in together. Officially. I want to give up my apartment and make this our home. Janet set down the dish she was drying and turned to face Nancy fully. Are you sure? That's a big step. I'm sure, Nancy said firmly. I spend every night here anyway. All my favorite things are here. My favorite person is here. It just makes sense. It makes sense, Janet agreed, then grinned. And I love the idea of waking up to you every single day. Every single day, Nancy repeated, sealing the promise with a kiss. They spent the next month making it official, Nancy giving notice on her apartment, combining their belongings, figuring out whose furniture to keep and whose to donate. It was a process full of small negotiations and compromises, but also full of joy as they created a space that truly belonged to both of them. Where should we put this? Nancy asked, holding up a framed photo from their Maine vacation, the two of them grinning at the camera with the ocean sparkling behind them. Bedroom, Janet said immediately. So it's the first thing we see when we wake up and the last thing we see before we sleep. Perfect, Nancy agreed, and Janet knew she wasn't just talking about the photo placement. As autumn returned, marking a full year since that first night Nancy had stayed over after Matthew's breakup, they settled into their new life together with contentment that felt both earned and natural. They had survived their first year as a couple, weathered the storms of coming out and family reactions and ex-boyfriends, and emerged stronger and more committed than ever. Do you ever regret it? Janet asked one evening as they sat on their couch, Nancy's head in her lap as Janet played with her hair. Any of it? The complications, the questions, the way some people look at us. Nancy was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. No, she said finally. I regret the time I wasted being scared. I regret not figuring this out sooner. But I don't regret choosing you, choosing us, choosing this life. Not for a second. Even when it's hard? Especially when it's hard, Nancy said, tilting her head to look up at Janet. Because the hard parts prove that this is real, that it matters, that it's worth fighting for. Janet leaned down to kiss her, soft and sweet and full of all the love she sometimes still couldn't believe she was allowed to feel. I love you, Janet whispered against Nancy's lips. I love you too, Nancy replied. More than I ever thought possible. As winter approached again, they began planning their second Christmas together, this time as an officially cohabiting couple. Nancy's parents were coming to visit, along with Janet's sister and her family, and they were all going to crowd into their small apartment for Christmas dinner. Are you nervous? Janet asked as they discussed the menu and sleeping arrangements. Terrified, Nancy admitted, but also excited. I want them to see how happy we are. I want them to understand that this isn't a phase or an experiment. This is my life, our life, and it's beautiful. It is beautiful, Janet agreed. Even when you leave your socks on the bathroom floor. Hey, Nancy protested, laughing. You leave your coffee cups everywhere. Touché, Janet conceded. We're perfectly imperfect together. Perfectly imperfect, Nancy repeated. I like that. The family visit went better than either of them had dared to hope. Nancy's mother spent most of the weekend asking Janet about her photography and sharing embarrassing stories about Nancy's childhood. Nancy's father helped Janet fix a leaky faucet and gruffly admitted that he had never seen his daughter so relaxed and happy. Janet's sister pulled Nancy aside to tell her how grateful she was that Janet had found someone who loved her so completely. You make her glow, Janet's sister said as they watched Janet play with her nephew in the living room. I've never seen her so at peace with herself. She makes me